Early 1943, on the sweltering airstrips of New Guinea, a man with oil-stained hands stood before a bomber that looked nothing like the one North American aviation had delivered. The glass nose, once meant for a bombardier to peer through, was gone. In its place, solid metal bristled with heavy machine guns, weapons pointed forward like a clenched fist. To many, it was madness. To others, it was illegal. But to the man who designed it, it was the only way to strike back. That man was Captain Paul Irving Gunn, though everyone who flew with him would one day know him by another name, Pappy. He was no textbook engineer, no polished graduate of West Point. He was a former Navy enlisted pilot, a civilian airline manager, and a father. By rights, his war should have been over before it began. Yet what drove him to ignore orders and rip apart U.S. bombers for his own vision wasn't just the Allied cause. It was something far more personal, something boiling in his chest since December of 1941, when Japanese bombers turned the skies above Manila into fire. On that morning, Gunn's family had still been in the Philippines. His wife Polly and their 4 children would soon fall into enemy hands, rounded up and sent to the grim internment camp at Santo Tomas. Every day they remained, there was a day he could not protect them. For Gunn, the official strategies being issued from Washington were far too slow. Bureaucracy would not save his family. But perhaps, if he could change the very way bombers fought, if he could turn them into predators that could rip Japanese convoys apart, then maybe he could bring the war to an end faster. Paul Gunn's war had begun in chaos. Once a retired Navy chief, he had been running Philippine Airlines when Japanese bombers reduced American airfields in Manila to smoking craters. In the confusion, his civilian planes were commandeered by the U.S. Army, and Gunn was pulled into uniform almost overnight. By the end of 1941, the Philippines was collapsing. Gunn flew desperate supply runs, dodged Zero fighters, and once crash-landed in the jungle before walking out and climbing back into another cockpit. His courage earned him decorations, but medals were nothing compared to the loss gnawing at him. His family imprisoned, his children growing up behind barbed wire. Transferred to Australia, Gunn carried a quiet fury into every mission. To him, each Japanese convoy steaming toward New Guinea wasn't just a strategic threat, it was a personal enemy. Yet he saw what others refused to admit: Allied bombing tactics were failing. High-altitude B-17s were magnificent in theory, but in practice, they hit less than 1% of moving ships. Japanese destroyers and transports maneuvered with ease, their troops landing almost unopposed. American ground forces, fighting through jungle and swamp, were dying because supplies kept flowing to the enemy unchecked. Gunn was not a man to accept futility. In dusty hangars and improvised workshops, he began tearing apart aircraft. He stripped bombardier stations from light bombers and replaced them with machine guns scavenged from wrecks. He rebalanced weight, reinforced frames, and locked turrets forward to add more firepower. Each change was unauthorized, yet each worked. His first modified A-20s swept low over Buna Airfield, their guns spitting fire at treetop height. The effect was shocking. Japanese defenders, used to lumbering high-altitude bombers, were cut down before they could react. For the first time, Allied pilots saw how a bomber could become something new, a flying predator. By late 1942, Gunn's reputation had spread beyond the dusty airstrips of New Guinea. He was no longer just a transport pilot improvising weapons. He had become the man commanders turned to when orthodox tactics failed. General George Kenney, the hard-driving air chief under MacArthur, saw promise in Gunn's wild ideas. He gave him a simple order: make the B-25 Mitchell bomber into something the Japanese could not ignore. The Mitchell was a solid medium bomber, reliable, durable, with a range long enough to strike deep into enemy waters. But as a ship killer, it was clumsy. Its bombardier nose was built for level bombing at altitude, not for combat at 50 feet above the waves. Gunn's solution was radical. He ripped out the bombardier, sealed the nose in armor plate, and mounted a cluster of heavy .50 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 at first, then 6, and eventually 8, all forward firing under the pilot's control. He locked dorsal turrets in the forward position, so even defensive gunners could add to the storm of fire. What emerged was not the bomber North American aviation had designed, but a flying fortress of cannons. The technical challenges were immense. Weight in the nose shifted the center of gravity forward, making the aircraft difficult to control. Recoil from 8 heavy guns shook the airframe violently. Ammunition fed through improvised chutes and boxes that Gunn himself tested in live fire, yet the modifications worked. At treetop level, the B-25 strafers, as they came to be called, were terrifying. Their firepower equaled that of several fighters combined, yet they still carried bombs slung beneath their wings. Gunn's conversions turned them into a dual weapon, part flying gun platform, part precision strike bomber. They were the Predator ships feared most, machines built for one purpose: annihilation. In early March 1943, Allied intelligence intercepted Japanese signals. A major convoy was departing Rabaul, bound for Lee on New Guinea's northern coast. It carried nearly 7,000 troops and their supplies, reinforcements meant to stall the Allied advance. Escorted by 8 destroyers and shielded by 0 fighters, it was the largest resupply attempt Japan had launched in the region. If those troops landed, the jungle campaign would grow bloodier. If they were stopped, the balance in New Guinea could shift. For General Kenny, it was the perfect test of Gunn's modified B-25s. At dawn on March 3rd, the sky over the Bismarck Sea was clear. The convoy churned forward at 7 knots, heavy transports wallowing in rough seas. From the north came the drone of American bombers. High above, B-17s dropped their loads from 5,000 feet, forcing ships to twist and scatter but sinking none. Then, from the horizon, came the low-flying Predators. The modified B-25s hurtled in at wave-top height, closing the distance at nearly 300 miles an hour. Pilots opened fire from 1,000 yards, streams of tracers stitching across the decks. 8 Browning guns per plane unleashed a torrent of lead that shredded superstructures, cut down gunners, and silenced anti-aircraft batteries. The decks turned into chaos before the bombs even fell. Then came the real killing stroke: skip bombing. Delayed fuse explosives bounced across the water like skipping stones, slamming into hulls below the armor belt. Explosions erupted beneath the waves, breaking keels, flooding compartments, and tearing transports apart. In less than 40 minutes, the convoy was in ruins. Transports burned, destroyers sank, and thousands of Japanese troops flailed in oil-slicked seas. The Bismarck Sea had become a graveyard, proof that Gunn's vision was not madness but revolution. When the smoke cleared over the Bismarck Sea, the scale of destruction stunned even seasoned commanders. All 8 Japanese transports had been sunk, along with 4 of their escorting destroyers. More than 5,000 enemy soldiers and sailors were dead, most swallowed by the sea before they could reach land. Of the original 7,000 troops, barely 1,200 made it ashore, many without equipment or weapons. For Japan, it was a catastrophe. For the Allies, it was vindication, the proof that air power, properly adapted, could strangle an enemy's logistics at their source. The impact reverberated across the Pacific. Never again would Japan attempt to run large daylight convoys within range of Allied aircraft. The route to New Guinea became a death trap, patrolled by strafers that hunted anything afloat: barges, transports, even small supply craft hugging the coastline. Japanese commanders turned to night movements and submarines, but the tide had turned. Gunn's modifications had altered the calculus of Pacific warfare. For the men who flew them, the B-25 strafer was both a weapon and a lifeline. Pilots who had once cursed the futility of high-altitude raids now believed in their aircraft. They knew that a single run could silence gun crews, tear through ships, and leave the ocean littered with burning wrecks. The psychological effect was just as powerful as the physical one. Japanese sailors came to dread the distinctive drone of right radial engines approaching low over the water, knowing that seconds later their world would erupt in gunfire and fireballs. From the battered airstrips of New Guinea to the sprawling bases in Australia, word spread quickly. Gunn's idea was no longer illegal. It was doctrine. His converted Mitchells were now the standard bearers of a new era in aerial warfare. The triumph of the B-25 strafer was more than a tactical success. It was a testament to what one determined individual could achieve when rules were bent for survival. Gunn's modified bombers became central to MacArthur's island-hopping campaign. They ranged across New Guinea, the Solomons, and later the Philippines, ripping through airfields, convoys, and fortified harbors. At Wewak, they destroyed nearly 200 Japanese aircraft on the ground. At Rabaul, they stormed one of the most heavily defended bases in the Pacific, blasting through smoke screens and anti-aircraft fire to sink cruisers and transports. Each raid reinforced a simple lesson: the age of slow, predictable bombing was over. But Gunn's war was always personal. Behind every mission lingered the thought of his wife and children, still trapped in Santo Tomas. For 3 years, he pushed innovations not only to win battles but to end the war sooner. When Manila was finally liberated in 1945, he reunited with his family, gaunt, scarred, but alive. For him, the reunion was the only victory that mattered more than any ship sunk. In the years that followed, the strafer's DNA lived on. Post-war air forces studied its lessons, adapting the idea of a gun-heavy strike aircraft into future designs. From the AC-47 Spooky in Vietnam to modern gunships, the lineage traced back to Gunn's unauthorized workshop in Australia. He had shown that sometimes the decisive weapon of a war could come not from factories or headquarters, but from a mechanic's determination and a father's desperation. Paul Pappy, Gunn, died in 1957 in a flying accident, still doing what he loved. Yet every surviving B-25 that thunders low over an airshow today carries his spirit. They are echoes of the man who turned a bomber into a fortress of cannons and changed the course of the Pacific War.